Welcome to the Ultimate Farm Wife podcast. On this channel, we're going to be discussing all things marrying a farmer, moving to the land, and becoming integrated with a family farming operation. Whether you're moving to the farm for the first time or whether you're moving back into a family farming operation, we discuss the ins and the outs of all of it. So let's jump into today's episode.
Hi, and welcome to the farm. Today we're talking with Arlene. Arlene, can you tell us about your family, your farm, and what goes on where you are?
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for having me on the podcast. So my name is Arlene and I live in Eastern Ontario, Canada. So if anyone has been to Canada or wants to check out a map, I'm kind of in that space between a couple of the biggest cities. So I'm between Toronto and Montreal. So I live somewhat close to a small town, but also within driving distance of some relatively big cities. So we're rural, but kind of have the best of both worlds. And we're not all that far from the US border either. So we're kind of in that space, if you're familiar at all with Canada, close to the city of Ottawa, which is Canada's capital. And in terms of my family, I'm a mom to 4 kids. So my oldest is a daughter, she's 18, and then I've got 3 boys who are 16, 13, and 9. And so that keeps us fairly busy. And my husband and I are on his family dairy farm. So he's 6th generation. So our kids will be 7th if any of them choose to stay here and farm. And so we live in the family farmhouse and we have Holstein cows, a couple of Jerseys that have come on the scene since my daughter has become even more cow crazy as she's gotten older. So we figure if your kids are dabbling in different breeds of cows, that's the least of your worries, right? So we have almost all Holsteins who are registered Holstein herd. So we milk 80 cows in a barn that we built the year after we got married because we, wanted to take on a whole bunch of debt right off at the start of our relationship. So we have a 20-year-old barn this year where we house and house all of our replacements. So we raise all of our female calves, obviously, from babies. So we have a nice heated calf in the winter and well ventilated all year round. And then we have our heifers and dry cows and all those things under cover because here in Canada you need to have housing for all year round. So they do go outside still, not every cow every day, but there is pasture options for them. But in the wintertime especially, and the hottest days of the summer, they actually prefer to be inside. So we are in a barn where we can house all of our animals. So around 200 head, usually, give or take, depending on the time of year and who all has had heifers. And we also grow most of our own feed and some for sale. So we have about 700 acres of owned land and then a couple hundred acres of rented land. So we do corn, soybeans, some dry corn to sell, a lot of silage, and then hay on a lot of our ground. We've got some ground that's not tillable, but good for hay. So we do a lot of wrapped bales and some dry hay as well. So that's kind of the farm and the family, I guess.
Farmer myself, I do have to ask, what crop are you turning into hay and silage?
So we do corn silage. So most of our silage is that way. We also, so a lot of our bales are wrapped. So I guess some people would call that baleage. We don't have bunks. We have upright silos. And then we do our haylage in wrapped big tubes, and then we do usually one big bag of corn silage to kind of tide us over in that time between when the silo is getting filled with next year's crop. And so we feed it at that bag in the fall as we're getting close to harvest time.
So here we either do the wrap or the bunker system. I haven't heard about the silo system. So for those in the community who also haven't heard about the silo system, how does it stay fresh and how does it not go off in a silo?
Right. So a silo is basically like a big tube, essentially. I mean, it's kind of an upright bunk, really. Like it's ours. There are different kinds, but ours are cement. So it's essentially like a bunk in the sense that it's just that it's all stacked on top of each other and sealed up. And so that silage still has that opportunity to ferment because it's stacked in a vertical formation instead of spread out in a bunk.
And what stops the top section as you're creating more air as it's emptying out to stop that from going off?
You've got such a small amount at the top, really. I mean, your silos are only going to be, trying to think of how wide they are. But they're, like because they're a small surface, your silo unloader is at the top. So you're actually taking silage from the top, not the bottom. So you have a piece of machinery that's kind of scraping that top level off and sending it down the chute. So your surface is pretty small, and the silo is covered at the top, like it has a dome on top of it. So there is a surface there, but I mean, it's getting unloaded kind of every day, right? So as you're feeding out of it, and when you're not feeding out of it, then you can seal it up and you don't have to worry about it because it's going to be self-contained.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes more sense that it's being taken from the top because we have bottom feeding silos here for all our grains and everything. So I was like, oh, how does that work?
Yeah, there'd be way too much pressure, right? Like because of as you get further down the silo, there is, like you have to drain off some of that silage liquid. But yeah, you're going to be that silo unloader is kind of a round piece of machinery that moves around and kind of chops the top surface level and sends it down a chute towards the bottom.
Yeah, absolutely.
The issues in a cold climate, sometimes they can freeze. We get temperatures in the winter, sometimes in the -20s into the -30s, not for like weeks at a time, but we do have those cold days, so those outside edges can get quite frozen and solid, and so then you sometimes have to go and chip that out or give it a few days to thaw before you go back and start to run that equipment again.
Yeah, well, that is good to know. So you moved to your husband's farm. So let's talk about first impressions when you first moved to the farm. Tell us a little bit about that transition, how it was, and any advice or tips that you have during that transition period.
Sure. So I am one of those people who was the daughter of a dairy farmer and swore as a kid I would never marry a farmer, and then did. So I feel like I did at least have a concept of what it was going to be like. At the same time, we were a long distance relationship for most of our dating life. I was still at university, about a 5-hour drive away from the farm, and he had already finished uni and was back home farming full time. So, we were hanging out in the summertime, but I had a full-time, I had summer jobs, and he was working on the farm, and then I'd go back to school, and we'd see each other maybe a couple times a month. So actually moving to the farm was definitely different than dating life. And I will say too, when I first moved to the farm, I was working in the city. So I was doing a shift work job in tech. And so I was commuting 2 hours a day. That's how long it took me to get to and from my office, and was working either day or evening shifts. So there wasn't a lot of time for me to actually be involved in the farm. So that transition time I didn't find as challenging as once I had kids and then was not doing other things, because I found that because I'd been commuting into the city and was working shifts, I didn't really get involved in the community that I was living in. I was, working either days or evenings, so you couldn't really, join clubs or, social activities all that easily, because it was every other week, and weekends seem to go by in a blur, as they do. And so that first, those first couple years on the farm, I didn't really feel like that much. I mean, I was a farmer's wife, but I didn't feel like I was really all that involved in the farm itself, because I was just it was a place to sleep at night and then back to the city again during the day.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that transition to adding the 4 children to the farm, one after the other, tell me how that changed with each child, and was there different hurdles that came with each, and with that role of trying to get more involved in the community, and then did you get more involved in the farm, and what did that look like?
For sure. So like I said, my oldest is 18. So 18 years ago, I had was off on my first maternity leave, and here in Canada, that means you get a year, and we had already toyed with the idea of me not going back after my year of mat leave. So I thought I knew what I was getting into with parenthood. And then I had a beautiful little girl who cried all the time, or that's how it felt anyway. I know she didn't cry 24/7, but there were a lot of tears, hers and mine. And so my adjustment to parenthood, it really did shake me. It wasn't what I was expecting. like I said, I've been commuting and not really connected to the community I was living in. So I didn't know very many people. And the people I did know, were my in-laws and who were very nice, but, didn't have young children. And so it was hard work that first year, especially to try and make connections and join things and try and figure out where my place was, because I knew that our goal was for me to be able to stay home and raise our kids and not have to go back to work in the city. So that was difficult for sure, but being close to a town helped a lot. There were, play groups for moms and babies to go to, and especially in the winter months, to have somewhere other than your house to be for even an hour or two a day made a huge difference. And I really tried to put myself out there and meet other parents and join different activities and go to the library for story time and all those types of things. So I did start to meet other parents with young children, which helps a lot with the isolation factor. So number 2 came along when she was a toddler. So she was 2 and a bit when I had my second, and it didn't feel as shocking for sure the second time around. We kind of had a routine going, and we could, we had some friends and people that we could depend on. And I will say that my mother-in-law has been fantastic from the very beginning in terms of being one of my biggest supporters and one of my biggest helps. So she was, especially in those early years, some days she felt like the second parent. I mean, my husband has always been very involved, but he was working long days, and I felt like I was home by myself a lot. So she was a huge help, and even having her house as another place to go with little kids when the snow's flying and you don't really want to bundle everybody up. We could go to her place, and the barn was another place that we could go. So we had a barn stroller and barn toys, and that was a place where I could go and walk laps and have the kids toddle around and pet the cows and all those types of things. And as they got a little older, could ride their tricycles up and down the feed alley and those types of things. So it was another place that we could go, because for me, I found that spending too much time alone in my house with my kids wasn't good for me, and I knew it wasn't really great for them either. So having a routine of getting out somewhere every morning, even if it was just to go to the barn and they could see Daddy and I could do a few laps around the barn, made a big difference. Then number 3, when he came around, so then I had a 4 and a 2.5-year-old. That I felt like was another struggle time for me. He was kind of a cranky baby as well. And at that point, my 2-year-old, so my second born, was starting to show signs of neurodiversity, and he really struggled with noise. So a crying baby with a toddler who does loud noises was particularly challenging. And so that was a hard time again, but at least I had established, more community connections. My mother-in-law was still a huge support. And I guess around that time, my daughter would have started junior kindergarten. So here they start school the year that they turn 4. And so she was a December birthday, but actually started in school when she was 3.5. So we had that kind of added, which, some days was good and some days it was just one more thing to get ready for, right? By the time you get them ready and off to school and get her out to the bus and those types of things was a challenge. But at least I knew that she was getting out of the house and seeing other people for a few hours, one less person to look after. And then 3 to 4 was our biggest gap. There's actually a 4-year time span there. And that was partly because of the struggles I had with my second and third. And also was kind of in that place where I was like, do I want more kids or not? And I think we would have been fine either way. But my husband and I are both from families of 4. And I think kind of we're both, felt pulled in that direction, that maybe 4 was the right number for us. And so after a few years, we decided that we would have one more. And, we were lucky enough to be people who fertility was not a challenge for us, like lots of people is. So ours were all able to be choices, which I know isn't the case for everyone. And 4 was actually, I think, my easiest because my standards had dropped. And so I really didn't have to my house was already dirty. And also actually after 3 was born, we had moved to the farm. When we had our first 2, we were on a farm property that was not right where the cows were. So it was only a few kilometers away. But it did make a big difference to have to load people into car seats. It's on a busy road. So it wasn't just, walk a few steps and you're in the barn. So moving to the farmhouse made a big difference to be able to be on site and, to know that when my husband was walking across the yard that he was coming back to the house kind of thing, and not have to, plow the driveway in the winter in order for him to get to the barn and those types of things. So that made a big difference. But yeah, number 4 was a chill baby, and my standards were low and the other kids were all in school too. So I did feel like he was the one where I actually, slept when the baby slept, or really kind of soaked it in more than the others. I think there's something about knowing it's your last too, because that did feel different for sure.
Now let's take a short break in today's episode to talk about Tupperware. Katja Williams, the ultimate farm wife, is also a Tupperware consultant. So whether you are looking for food storage containers and options, kitchenware such as microwave cooking, baking trays, knives, tools, and other utensils that you can use in the kitchen, or other lunch and drink options such as bento boxes, travel mugs and flasks, picnic wares and sets, as well as reusable cutlery. Or even if you are eco-friendly minded and you want to use microfiber cloths or recycled products, then please click the link below in the show notes and have a look at what is on offer at Tupperware. Tupperware is also always looking for new consultants. If you want to start your side hustle or your business for off-farm income, something for yourself, then please reach out to myself, Katja Williams, the ultimate farm wife, and talk about starting your own Tupperware business or side hustle. Now let's get back to today's episode.
Yeah, it absolutely does. So a question that yourself and Katie asked when I was on your podcast a few weeks ago was, how do you deal with more kids than you have hands? So I'll throw that question back to you, because 4 within that age gap is still quite a small age gap. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I felt like ours were at least not so close together. I guess a couple of times I had 2 kids in diapers, but at least the older one was always verbal, and I could communicate well with them by the time the next baby came around. I always told people that we were never going to try for another one until the one before was sleeping through the night, and none of my kids slept through the night until they were over a year old. So there was no risk that we were having kids that close together, because I breastfed all of them for a year or sometimes a little bit longer, and they were not the worst sleepers, but sleeping through the night was just not something that was in the cards for them or for us. I did some sleep training, but it didn't help with that middle of the night feeding. So it was fine. I got used to it. You get used to chronic sleep deprivation after a while, right? So I think a lot of it was setting up routines, having, stations in the house where, like there was the opportunity to change a diaper in multiple different spots. Lots of baby gates. We live in a 2-level house, so making sure that, people couldn't get upstairs that couldn't manage stairs yet, or having gates at the top of the stairs. So, upstairs coming down. A lot of it was, just kind of multitasking, learning how to bathe 2 or 3 kids in the bathtub at the same time, and just, set up towels and have things, within hand's reach so that you could manage it. I used a backpack, like a hiking style carrier, for a long time. There were times where, especially for grocery shopping, I had one who really liked to try and reach into the back and grab the stuff in the cart and fling it out. Yeah. So that one would go in the backpack carrier, and then the other one could go in the shopping cart, and then, sometimes I would pick a grocery store depending on the style of cart they had. Like if I had to take 3 shopping, then there was one store that had like the 2 seats in the front, and so I could have 1 on my back and then 2 in the cart. I mean, it was just a lot of strategy in terms of thinking through like what can I do by myself, and what are the things that I do need to tap in help for. So like I said, my mother-in-law or my husband, like we do live close enough to a town with a Walmart that's open till 10 o'clock. So if it meant going to get groceries after everyone went to bed at night, then that for that week was the better option than trying to take everyone at once. They're that age where there wasn't a lot of options in terms of, ordering groceries and even picking them up at the store. I feel like a lot of those types of services came around during COVID, and they would have been really helpful when I had little kids, but it wasn't the way it was then.
No. And so your role on the farm itself, how has that changed from when you first moved there to when you had kids to what it is now? Did you start being lightly hands-on and then move into more of a hands-on role? How does that look?
So at the beginning, like I said, I was working full-time off farm, and so farm work wasn't really part of my life at all, other than, if I got tapped in for a milking maybe on a weekend, or we show cows a couple of times a year. I would often try and take some holidays for cow shows, that kind of thing. But for the most part, I wasn't hands-on on the farm. And when the kids were little, I know for some people, they don't have the choice, or they want to bring their kids out to the barn, or still be able to be out there milking every day or twice a day or 3 times a day, depending on your setup. But at that time, my father-in-law was still active and quite involved, and we had enough help, and we chose for me to not be in the barn all that much when the kids were really little. That kind of transitioned, I want to say, kind of in the 2019, 2020 time frame. I started going out and milking in the mornings. The kids had gotten a little bit older, and so I didn't have to wake anybody up. And because we were living on farm, I could go out and milk in the morning and feel confident that, that if they woke up before I got in, I'd go out about 4:30, 5 o'clock, and can be back in the house by 7:30, 8 o'clock kind of thing. So I figured by the time they were a little bit older, that I felt okay with that setup. And if anything, the older kids could contact me. They could get in touch. They could call it to the barn. We have a phone line, or they could just walk across the yard and come and get me if something happened in the house and they needed me. So it was more about once the kids were old enough to care for themselves, because to find childcare for early in the morning, realistic, and we didn't want to haul kids out of bed and bring them to the barn, especially in the winter. And so I started doing morning milkings with my husband, and then kind of have added to that since then as the years have gone on. And it's kind of also morphed into, as our kids have gotten older, now we have routines that any of us can do. Not so much my 9-year-old, but my 18-year-old is now at university part of the year, but is home and working with us in the summer months. So there are a lot of chores that she and I can do interchangeably. My 16-year-old, my 13-year-old are both milking cows now. So there's kind of, have kind of a weekly schedule now, and it's got flex to it, right? If there's good weather and we're going to be doing hay for a few days, then that changes things. But so I am mostly milking in the tie stall. That's usually a 2-person job typically. I do a lot of the cleanup jobs, sterilization, washing down the milk house, washing milkers, all of those types of things that have to be done pretty frequently, all the time on a dairy farm. And I'm not really a tractor driver, so I suppose if I really had to, I could, but most of the time the crops get done by my husband, and we have one full-time employee who does some tractor work, and my father-in-law is still on calf feeding and some tractor jobs. So if he's on a tractor, I'll usually feed calves, and if he's ever away for any reason, then calf feeding comes onto my plate too. But we want him to be as involved as he wants to be, and at this point he likes calf chores, so we'll let him keep doing that.
If you're enjoying listening along with us today and learning some tips, tricks, and advice, then please like, subscribe, and even share this interview with someone who you think would need to hear this information or who might benefit from other interviews done right here on this channel. Now let's get back into today's episode.
And how is jumping back into being hands-on in the dairy? Is it a different setup to the dairy that you came from, or was it sort of just, it was natural and you sort of just picked it straight back up and ran with it, or was it a different setup?
It was quite a bit different, actually. So the farm I grew up on was larger, and my dad farmed with his two brothers, and there were three separate farms, and so each farm kind of had its own specialization. And so I did grow up on the facility where the milk cows were, but we were in a parlor setup, and we didn't have, the calves were calved out at a different location. So it was basically just milking cows. It was a freestall and a parlor. So I grew up milking, but not until I was a teenager, because you had to be tall enough to be able to reach. Whereas in a tie stall, you can start a little earlier. So that was, I found it more physically demanding. And especially at the beginning, the first few weeks, I was like, I don't know if I can do this, like just had to build up the physical endurance, right? It's a lot of squatting and bending and moving. I was doing a lot of those things with kids, but yeah, it was definitely different. And those first few weeks, I was a little worried that I wasn't going to be able to do it. But you start to do something every day, and it gets to be routine again. But yeah, I mean, the being around cows part, that doesn't change too much, but the physical setup is definitely different.
Yeah. And the showing circuit, you mentioned that earlier, you'd take some time off work and do the show circuit. So what does the show circuit look now with 4 kids? Are all the kids showing as well?
Well, for a few years, we pushed hard for everyone to show, and we have let up on that a little bit. We figure that by the time they're teenagers, they know what they're into and what they're not. So we have a couple teenage boys who will do the chores that are required of them, but walking cows around in a circle, as they describe it, is not for them. So that's fine. They help, but actually showing is not their thing. But our 18-year-old, like I mentioned earlier, is cow crazy. And so I'm not even sure how many. I think there's more than 10 shows on the calendar for this summer already. She's already been to 3, and it's only the middle of July. So yes, her goal is to fit in as many cow shows this summer as possible, and then hopefully qualify to go to the Royal Winter Fair again this fall in Toronto. So she's definitely into cows. She started to do a lot of clipping, and my father-in-law actually a couple years ago, he had a small sheep barn, just some show sheep. He had a couple of breeds, and so he had a smaller barn across the road from us beside his house where he always had sheep. And so when he decided to retire out of his hobby of raising sheep, it was the very next day that my daughter's show string moved across the road. And so we call it now the Heifer Hotel. So we've got 5 kids, including her 4-H members that have calves there, and then there's a few extras that she's added to the string that maybe don't have a 4-H member associated with them, but that are also part of her feeding program. And so they all have their own pens and feeding set up, and they're getting trained. And yeah, so we have a bunch of neighborhood kids who are also into showing, that can have their cows here who aren't from farms themselves.
That's a really nice setup to be sharing that and opening that up to the community as well. Yeah. So when your oldest goes away to uni, does she take the cattle with her, or do they stay here on farm?
So September, there are a few shows locally that they need to attend, so they stay here. And then since she's gotten into jerseys, this year's jersey is actually borrowed. And so it's from a farm closer to where she goes to university. So after kind of the last qualifying show locally, it'll move back to its home farm, and then she's only about a 20-minute drive, and can then go out and train her calf while she's at university through October and November, and then the Royal Winter Fair is in November. So she still gets in her training time, but doesn't have to drive 5 hours home to work with her heifer.
Yeah. And does she have her own float set up to be able to transport, or do you have to get one of the farm trucks involved in the logistics of moving that around?
Yes, at this point, my husband is the chauffeur still. So yeah, she doesn't drive the truck and trailer yet. So the farm pickup, and we have a cattle truck. He's on transportation, but he doesn't get too many jobs anymore. It shows. So that's his main role.
Yeah,
Trucking and cheerleader.
absolutely. Love to see him with some pom-poms.
We were talking about getting some custom foam fingers, like there's those cheering hands maybe for our county this year for the Royal. So love to see if we can print some of those up.
I would love to see photos if you do that.
Yeah. We were at a show recently, and some of the dairy moms had some, what was the slogan on? Dairy Moms Against White Show Pants was the slogan on the shirt. So a few of us got matching t-shirts and cow print shoes just to hopefully embarrass our teenagers a little bit.
And did it work?
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. So, Arlene, would you say the early years of raising kids on the farm would have been your largest hurdle, or was it more the physical work integrating or something else? What was the largest hurdle of being on your husband's farm?
I think looking back, probably the early years were more challenging for me personally. I think that the combination of the isolation that comes along with parenthood, and like you said, having more kids than hands, and all the other stuff that goes along with raising young kids, the sleep deprivation, having a spouse that works unpredictable and usually long hours, definitely adds to that. So I would say that the early years were the most challenging for me personally. The farm aspect, I guess, was mostly just challenging for me in the sense that it meant that my husband was not always available when I wanted him to be, right? But yet I look at other people whose, spouses are away on business for weeks or maybe months at a time, or, at least I knew where he was, even if he was in a tractor and I could see him, maybe I could send a child out and ride along with him, or I knew that, yeah, maybe there's a cow calving, but eventually, yes, he's still going to be here at the end of the day, kind of thing. I did try and keep that in perspective, but yeah, those early years were definitely probably my most challenging. I was reflecting the other day though I hate that sentiment of, that you're going to miss it and that you should treasure every moment, because I don't think that that's realistic, and it's not. It doesn't help for the person who's feeling overwhelmed when their kids are little. But something that I've been noticing lately is, when they're little and you are the center of their world, you could walk out the door to get the mail and come back in, and it's the most exciting thing that's ever happened to them, right? They're hugging your knees and they're so excited to see you. And living in a house with a tween and teenagers, I'm not saying that they don't love me, but I don't get the same level of adoration as I used to, which I kind of miss a little bit. I feel, for a while you feel like a superstar in your own house, and yeah, it's not really like that anymore.
Kids give you that reaction. If I go out to get something from outside, mine usually go into meltdown because I didn't take them outside with me.
Well, yes, yeah, that too. It still means that they think you're the most incredible thing, though.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Now they're like, what, you were gone? Okay. I didn't notice.
Okay, Mom.
Sure.
So earlier in the interview, we were talking about you were setting up your routines to make sure, to help with the amount of children you have, to make sure everything's in hand reach. So how did those routines play out when your husband was home? Did you relax them a little bit to be able to encourage him to have his own sort of routines and systems with the kids? Or was he very much on board with what the routine was and how he could get involved in that?
I found that he was usually pretty good to come on board with whatever I was doing. I think even still, I still feel like I'm more of a helper on the farm than, the main operator. Obviously, I'm not the decision maker when it comes to, on a high level of things. Yes, we make decisions together, obviously, but day to day, he runs the farm and I still run the house, right? Was kind of how our roles ended up. And so he would defer to me, but he was pretty good to be, to also be on board with, like, if he walked in and it was bath time, be like, all right, I'm going to go back to making supper and now you take over here. Or, he was pretty good to always kind of jump in. I think he recognized the fact that once he walked in that, he was going to have to pick something up, or if someone was crying or whatever, like he would look to me and say, like, what can I do that's most helpful in this moment, right? Where should I be, kind of thing. So if something's boiling over on the stove, or if a kid's freaking out in another room, like what's the most important thing right now?
So a lot of the community that I'm building with the Ultimate Farm Wife, a lot of questions always come in with, okay, so if you're sort of looking after the household, the domestics, and he's looking after the farm, and you do have, a layer of conversation, especially if he's still working quite well with his father on board, what do the business decisions that you are involved in, what aren't you involved in, and how do you feel about some of those decisions maybe being made that impacts your future, but you don't have, that day-to-day say on that?
I think that one thing that was both challenging at the time, but has ended up being an overall good thing for us as a couple and as a farm, was that my in-laws fairly early on actually transferred ownership to us. And we, after taking ownership, ended up incorporating the business, but we are still the only two shareholders at this point. So his father, I think fairly early into our relationship, took a step back, has always been willing to, be consulted in things, and, is very interested in what we're doing, and is still working with us, but has been mostly hands off when it came to business decisions, which when we were in our 20s was challenging, because that's kind of when it started. But then you look at people who are, in their 60s and have 80-year-old parents who are still involved in every decision, and its own set of challenges, right? So I think that did help. And even, I feel like even when my husband probably knew he was going to defer to management when it came to business decisions, he did always still consult me. And I've always sat in on every meeting with our banker and with our accountant, and those types of meetings I've always been involved in from the very beginning. I'm not always sitting in on every meeting with our crop advisor or our veterinarian, like the day-to-day kind of management stuff. Sometimes I might find a sitter for those things, but there would be other times where it was like, you know what, you go ahead and have those conversations, because I'm not going to have anything to contribute. And if I'm going to get a babysitter, I don't necessarily want it to be to go and talk to our crop consultant. So, there were those things too, where I was fine to kind of give up, what control. I don't know that control is the right word, but to give up being part of that process, because I knew that I was okay with he was consulting with someone else who knows more than us, and so between them, then they can figure that out, right? With our nutritionist or those types of conversations, like, you go ahead, I don't mind.
Yeah,
not being involved in the minutia of all of those not little, I mean, they're big conversations, but if I don't have anything to contribute, then I'm okay to check out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings me to the end of my official questions for today. But was there any other tips, tricks, or advice you would give to someone who is moving to the farm for the first time, either coming from a farming background or not, in that, moving to the farm, transitioning through the years and through the ages of kids? Any advice?
Sure. I mean, I kind of already alluded to my relationship with my mother-in-law, but I do feel like a lot of, I don't want to use the word success necessarily, but a lot of the ways that things have worked well for us, I give credit to my in-laws for being very open and understanding. But I think that my husband and I have also tried hard to make sure that we respected their boundaries, and that it's a reciprocal relationship in many ways. I mean, my mother-in-law, especially now, is not involved in the farm. When she was younger, she was, but now it was never her passion. She was a town wife, and I think that she also has that perspective too, right? Where she moved to the farm not knowing much of anything, and then ended up being very involved for a lot of years, because that was the situation that they were in. So she has really good perspective in terms of kind of what I might need or how she can be supportive. But, when things are busy, she'll make a meal and send it over to my house. And in the same token, if I'm, baking for the kids, then I'll make some extra and send it over to her house. Just little gestures like that, I think, go a long way to create relationships with someone, because there aren't many families who have to live and work with their in-laws. And I know that's not everyone's situation, but if it is, it takes work. And, whenever they call with an issue with their computer, or they want to get something printed, or just those little things that don't seem like a big deal to me, I do try and prioritize those things. Or if they need something moved in their house, or just those simple things. Or now that our kids are older, the teenagers, they cut their grandparents' grass because it's something that's getting harder for them to do. So I think that really putting work into that in-law relationship has really added value to my life. But it's been an intentional, it's not always easy. I'm not saying that it is. And for quite a while, my husband's grandmother, she's just away at 99, but she was also part of that dynamic, because until we moved into this farmhouse, his grandma lived here. And so that was also another relationship that kind of required tending to, in a sense, right? When the kids were little, that was another place we would, we'd go and visit Granny and stop in at the house, and just check in on her and make sure that, if things needed to done around the yard, or those types of things got done, because, this was also her home for her entire married life. So we had to make sure that relationship was honored as well. So, I mean, as much as we want the people who you're moving to farm with to value you and your contributions, I think it's important to remember that we have to value and honor the contributions of the generations that have established this business, and to make sure that we give them the respect that they're owed to.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree with that. That's something great to put in. I think sometimes we forget to maintain those relationships, or we don't think about having to maintain those relationships, because sometimes you can put them in the category of family. So it's always a good reminder that is, you do need to maintain those relationships. And you mentioned boundaries. I'm all for boundaries as well. So making sure that, you know theirs, and you're clearly communicating yours as well. So really appreciate that. Arlene, earlier in the episode, I mentioned that you and Katie have a podcast, and I've previously been on that. So I will link the episode we did together in the show notes below. But while we're here, would you like to give a shout out for Barnyard Language?
Absolutely. So, like we already mentioned, I'm the Canadian co-host, and my friend Katie is the American co-host of Barnyard Language. And so it is a parenting podcast for farmers, or a farming podcast for parents, either way around. We talk to a lot of farmers like Katja and other people about the unique challenges that go along with raising kids on farms and ranches and homesteads. And we also talk to parenting experts and relationship experts, therapists, all those types of people who have experiences that are relevant to farming parents. So if you are a parent, then you can check us out.
Yes, and I absolutely love the podcast. That is how we met, because I have been an avid listener for a little while now. So I will link that all below. It is definitely worth checking out, community, and we will see you all next time in another episode.